Glad to have everyone here today. We're here to talk about things that, from a threat landscape perspective, what we think CISOs need to be concerned or prepared for. Hopefully, this discussion can help lay some framework and some landmarks for what you need to be considering. Joining us today, the smart ones in the room. First up is Eddie Mitchell. He's our VP of Sales Engineering at Analyst One. He's a highly motivated, dedicated, and resourceful security practitioner. He's got over 20 years of industry experience, particularly working with customer success and field engineering and early stage startups and solving a lot of fun problems. Over the course of his career, he served as a consultant, a researcher, a technical sales leader for a lot of disruptive opportunities, including working with things like Riptech, Securion, NetWitness, Invincia, Invitas, Flashpoint, Polarity, Hubble, and Intel. And of course, we're privileged to have him here. Joining Eddie is Frank Gentile, who is the Director of Customer Success at Replica Cyber. He's got over 15 years of experience in cyber product companies, including IBM, Carbon Black, and of course here at Replica. He works closely with cybersecurity and financial crime teams to help them operate in a high-risk digital environments while maintaining investigative effectiveness, meaning he likes to help people getting their job done. He frequently presents to industry and law enforcement audience on topics such as secure digital investigations, threat intelligence operations, and working safely in hostile online ecosystems. Myself, I'm James Nixon. I lead customer success here at Analyst One, and I'll try to contribute something useful during this conversation. But that's why, with Eddie and Frank's experience, it's why we wanted to have them be here today and help address this question: what CISOs must prepare for. To lay out kind of how things are going to roll, we got some upfront kind of lay of the landscape, some research we've done to help present a broader picture. Then we'll shift into a little bit of a dialogue amongst ourselves just to address some major objectives and focus areas we've seen, and then open it up at the very end for broader Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions along you go, we encourage you to spam them into whichever social media platform you're watching us on, and we look forward to addressing them later on. With that, Eddie, floor is yours, please, to start us off.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. Really appreciate the introduction. Very privileged to share the stage with you and our esteemed colleague, Frank from Replica. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just cover the main agenda topics. James just kind of gave like a brief summary of those, but I just want to drill down on those for a moment here before we get going. So first, I'm going to kick us off by providing a briefing on the top 3 threats shaping cybersecurity spending in 2026. After that, we'll get into more of an interactive discussion where I'll bring both Frank and James to a discussion around how regulatory and geopolitical landscape are impacting CISO thought processes around enterprise security priorities. This will also include some discussion and highlights around relevant KPIs to be thinking about. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A from the audience. So yeah, let's go ahead into the next slide. All right, so jumping straight in. So the top threat that we are highlighting on today's webinar briefing, it should come as no surprise to anyone in the audience: financially motivated cybercrime, in particular ransomware data extortion. So the graphic on this slide is showing an aggregate view of year-over-year actor claims posted on data leak sites. Apologies if this is a little bit difficult to read. I was wanting to fit this graph into a PowerPoint slide, but basically what's of noteworthy here is there was a significant spike that we saw in breach claims made in both January and February of this year, which is that blue line. And this represented a significant spike compared to the same months in 2025, before it sort of leveled off and came more or less back in line with 2025 numbers for both March and April. What's also interesting here is if you compare aggregate numbers thus far in 2026 in terms of adversarial breach claims on public leak sites, to the same period in 2025, we're seeing an approximate 6% increase in aggregate breach claims for the same time period in 2025. So go ahead and next slide. So on the same topic of ransomware data extortion, this graphic provides a breakdown showing adversarial targeting by country. And so there should be no surprises on this one either. So the US of A tops the list in terms of preferred targeting for cyber adversaries. So thus far in 2026, US orgs accounted for 44% of all claims on publicly available data leak sites, which more or less aligns to what we saw in 2025. And obviously from an adversarial perspective, you're going to continue to focus on targeting orgs with not only larger average revenue sizes, but also those organizations where there's an increased likelihood of obtaining a large ransom payout. On this next slide, basically what we're doing here is illustrating ransomware attack volume by adversary collective. When I was taking a look at this data in particular, the main surprise to me, a lot of these adversaries at the top of the list are fairly well known. The one that kind of stood up to me in particular, maybe just because I haven't been following as closely as I should, is the cybercrime group known as the Gentlemen. So you can see that they actually represent quite a significant share of ransomware data extortion claims made in 2026. So apparently I did a little bit of research on this particular group, and apparently they recently emerged back in August of last year, likely based or comprised rather of members originating as an offshoot from the Qlin group or Qlin group. So they're known for relative sophistication in their operations and are somewhat selective in their targeting. So not so much opportunistic in their targeting, but more sort of selective in what organizations they choose to target. And they also are known to utilize double extortion tradecraft, where they conduct data theft, deploy ransomware to encrypt the victim organization's data, and then demand payment to both recover the data and not market it or sell it on dark web forums or marketplaces. So definitely a group to track and keep a close eye on. And also as a heads up to everyone attending this webinar, please make sure you follow Analyst One and be on the lookout for a comprehensive adversary profile on the Gentlemen that is soon to be published by our very own Anastasia Sentsova. So in addition to the case studies, articles, and reports that we publish on our website, analystone.com, under the resources section of the website, you'll actually see a specific page for threat actor profiles. There's a lot of them already present there, but we're going to be adding one for the Gentlemen very, very shortly. So certainly make sure you're following us. So just to wrap up on threat number one, ransomware data extortion, obviously highly disruptive with devastating potential financial impact for victim organizations, and unfortunately not going away anytime soon, only continuing to trend upwards. So next slide. All right. So on the threat number two, third-party and supply chain compromise. So basically, I rendered this particular graph based on the previous 3 years worth of data sourced primarily from the Verizon Data Breach Intelligence Report. And this is related to confirmed breaches where there was known third-party involvement. And so according to Verizon data, there was a 2x increase in year-over-year third-party related breaches from 2024 to 2025. You can see it jump from 15 to 30%. I was hoping that the 2026 data breach intelligence report would be released prior to this webinar going live, so I'd have the most recent stats to see if that trend is continuing into 2026, but no such luck. So we'll have to kind of wait and see in terms of like whether this trend is going to continue in the future. That being said, if you advance to the next slide, so far, just based on activity within the recent past, not only towards the middle to end of 2025, but also continuing in 2026, it's unfortunately not looking very good. So in this slide, I just sort of cherry picked a few of the more high profile cases from the recent past. So I'm not going to cover all 6 of these, but I am going to focus on the ones on the top row. So hopefully folks on the webinar are kind of familiar with these because, again, these were very, very highly publicized third-party related breaches. So the first I'm going to cover going from left to right, Notepad++. So back in February, Notepad++ disclosed that state-sponsored hackers, which were later attributed to the Chinese APT group known as Lotus Blossom, aka Lotus Panda, had managed to redirect Notepad++ update traffic to adversarial controlled infrastructure to deliver compromised software updates between June and December of 2025. So what is that, 7 months worth of hijacked Notepad++ software updates before it was ultimately discovered and shut down. So obviously major impact there. Notepad++ is a very, very widely used text editor. In the middle there, Axios. So for those that aren't familiar, Axios is a JavaScript web library that's heavily used in Node.js applications. So they had compromised updates published to their NPM registry for about 3 hours. The compromised NPM packages included a remote access Trojan, a rat implant that was ultimately found to have been published by the North Korean state-sponsored adversary group known as Sapphire Sleet, aka UNC 1069, which consequently also has strong suspected ties to the more well-known APT38 group, also known as Blue Noraf or Stardust Kalima. And then lastly, on the top row there, Light LLM. So again, for those that aren't familiar with the technology, Light LLM is a unified API gateway for multiple AI provider LLMs, including providers like OpenAI and Anthropic. So they disclosed that adversaries had manually uploaded hijacked versions of 2 of their Python packages to PyPy via compromised credentials for about 40 minutes before discovery and removal. So this activity was later attributed to the cybercrime gang known as Team PCP that was behind similar supply chain attacks against security tools such as the Trivy vulnerability scanner and Checkmarx Kix. So if you're not familiar with Kix, it's an open source static code scanning tool. So obviously very, very high impact supply chain compromises, again, that we're seeing very, very recent activity for. You can see there on the slide as recently as, February, March of this year. So very, very noteworthy, very, very timely in nature. So next slide, please. So threat number 3. Again, this one should be fairly well known to everyone in the audience. Basically, identity compromise, credential compromise, right? Identity-centric social engineering and credential theft. So CrowdStrike in particular has published some fairly recent statistics on this particular threat. First in their global threat report that was published back in February of last year, and then later in August in their follow-up threat hunting report. So in their global threat report, they claim and I actually had to double check this because I originally thought this was a typo. So they originally claimed that there is a 442% increase, not 42, not 44, a 442% increase in voice phishing or vishing operations between the first and second half of 2024. And then later in their threat hunting report in August, as I mentioned, they claimed that vishing was on track to double the 2024 volume by the end of 2025. So obviously doubling it on top of a 442% increase in 2024 is pretty eye-opening. So the graphic on this slide that I have up here represents a very recent case study published by Google Threat Intelligence in January of this year, so very, very recent, related to observed activity that Google tracks under multiple threat clusters. So UNC 6661, UNC 6671, and UNC 6240, which interestingly seem to share similar TTPs to the more well-known Shiny Hunters cybercrime group. So in their documented campaign that you can see the URL down there at the bottom of the slide if you want to check it out if you haven't already, threat actors called victims at targeted organizations, right? So these are voice phishing, right? Pretending to be IT staff and claiming that they were updating organizational MFA settings. And so they directed the employees on the phone to browse to a fake authentication portal where they not only harvested Okta credentials, but also MFA codes that they were then later used to register their own devices so that they could basically get MFA codes. So as Google noted in their write-up, obviously there's a lot of different sort of recommendations along with technical indicators and those sorts of things. But one of the key takeaways that, again, this should be no surprise to anyone on the call is for orgs to disable push-based and SMS-based MFAs in favor of more phishing-resistant MFA methods in order to prevent these sort of multi-stage social engineering attacks. Next slide, please. And so the last slide on the topic of social engineering and ID theft when it comes to credential abuse is related to the prevalence of phishing as a service and adversary in the middle toolkits, right? So this graphic kind of gives a composite of several of the most commonly used adversary in the middle toolkits used at this time. And so while each of these has sort of like some very unique capabilities in terms of like impersonating different authentication services and different cloud hosted services, the main sort of targets for these adversary in the middle toolkits is impersonating Okta, Microsoft 365, Gmail and Google Workspace logins, OneDrive, Outlook, SharePoint, etc. And so something of note here is that Okta published a case study late last year in October related to a multi-stage campaign that used employee benefits or HR themed phishing lures that employed adversary in the middle techniques to intercept login credentials and MFA codes, in addition to intercepting Okta credentials and session cookies via Okta impersonation. So basically what these toolkits do is if they detect federated authentication mechanisms like Okta are enabled, they basically redirect to secondary impersonation websites to be able to harvest Okta credentials and session cookies. And so one of the key takeaways here for CISOs and anyone that's part of the audience is the prevalence of sophisticated turnkey toolkits is lowering the barrier of entry for adversaries wishing to conduct sophisticated multi-stage identity and credential theft, even when compensating controls like MFA and federated authentication mechanisms are already deployed and in place. All right, so that sort of like wraps up the threat briefing in the first part of the webinar. At this point, or maybe kind of just bring in or turn it back over to James and bring James and Frank back in, where we're actually going to dive in and like cover some of these some topics around like how is sort of like geopolitical and risks actually like redefining enterprise security priorities.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie, very much, and thank you for doing the research. Was able to get our beginning point to start things off. I mean, there's the lay of the land there, from working backwards from identity to third party, back to ransomware. There are prevalent threats, and the creativity around them is unfortunately high. If only these people could apply their wonderful brains to more productive solutions to society. What we've organized here, though, is some conversations around what we traditionally see CISOs working from objectives. You see them on screen. I'm not going to read them because that's boring. We're going to kind of go through them one-on-one, a bit of a back and forth here, just to have that next stage of our discussion. So can we go next slide, please? So objective number one, traditionally we see CISOs focusing on protecting that perimeter and reducing the technical risk in light of these threats that Eddie summarized and others. But we've seen maybe a proposed revision. So each of the slides are going to format a little bit like this, just to talk about where historically we've looked and where we see possibly a better way to look going forward. Frank, we wanted to get your perspective first on the traditional approach versus how you would advise people moving forward, if you don't mind taking kind of first response at your thoughts on how they can, CISOs can better address regulatory and geopolitical risk related to this focus, this objective.
Yeah, thanks, James. And, maybe at first blush, if folks in the audience read how we're sort of thinking about the evolution of this priority, you might maybe not even charitably consider it a capitulation, right? I think one of the things you can think of when you refocus from, when you transfer from can we stop the incident, right? I mean, many CISOs that I've had the pleasure of working with have sort of made it their stock in trade to say, look, I'm going to defend the perimeter. This won't happen on my watch. It's Gandalf on the bridge. You shall not pass. To almost accepting the sobering reality. I mean, Eddie did a great job with his research, right? I mean, a cyber event is going to happen. An ICT interruption is going to happen. And so as much as a redefinition as it is sort of an evolution or an increase in scope of the CISO's domain, it goes from, listen, protecting the perimeter is still important, right? I mean, that's still something that organizations need to have a level eye on. But the second order responsibility quickly becoming a first order responsibility in this environment is, how do we assure business resilience, right? How do we continue to keep the business moving, at least critical elements of the business moving in the throes of an event, right? Because it's not an if, it's a when at this point, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that little 2-letter acronym that everyone has on their mind. That is sort of enabling and emboldening threat actors to unfortunately perpetrate this reality. And I think one of the things I would call out is, like, you're seeing regulation, talking about regulatory drivers of this. EU has DORA, which is a pretty comprehensive resilience framework that they're implementing across the EU. The U.S. has sort of an amalgamation of these types of things. There's not sort of one DORA equivalent in the U.S. You have NIST, you have some other frameworks. But the conversation is quickly shifting from, how do we stop how do we go from zero events to, okay, we have an event. What are the mission critical systems so that we can continue to keep the organization moving, keep them afloat? How do we analyze the attack? How do we analyze the events and reproduce the events that are happening? How do we gather intelligence on those things when our systems are potentially impacted? And so I think the interesting thing to me about the evolution of this first objective, which I believe of the 4 we're going to talk about, is probably the most dyed-in-the-wool CISO statement, protect the perimeter, reduce the risk. I think organizations are grappling with the evolution of having to deal with, what do I do when that happens? Okay, when stage 1 doesn't quite go the way we want it to go, what can and should we do in the throes of that event? And Eddie, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how you see this evolution.
Yeah, for sure. No, that was great insight, Frank. Yeah, so I mean, I think the key takeaway here is just moving away from the traditional mindset where we're squarely focused on prevention as the primary goal, and more towards being able to provide business resilience or prove resilience. And one of the ways that obviously we tackle this problem at Analyst One is by leveraging our platform to do automatic threat classification of threat data from hundreds of individual sources, right? And so I think in terms of being able to make board level decisions and being able to basically prove resilience, being able to bring more internal stakeholders to the table in terms of defining those general and priority intelligence requirements, and not just having those intel requirements be defined by the security program and by the security stakeholders, but actually incorporating input from multiple business units in terms of what are the threats that they are most concerned about, right? And then being able to provide that visibility and those metrics in terms of how we're able to provide continuous monitoring and classification of threat intelligence and threat data to align with those objectives.
Yeah, and I would say, sorry, go ahead, James.
I think it's a curveball. So Frank, say your thought first, and then I'll throw it in the room.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think that's that makes a ton of sense. There's a couple different vectors here which you have to sort of take this problem, right? And I think the other thing that is important, and the thing that we focus on at Replica, is providing operational space, a platform where you can retain continuity and retain the ability to prosecute intelligence that you're gathering, even if your core systems may be impacted, right? We provide that platform for you to be able to respond in real time. And I think you have to have both elements of it. You have to have the operational component, but you also have to have the intelligence component working hand in glove to be positioned to be able to respond effectively.
So curveball, as a question, the conversation here has made me think of right now. So no, didn't do any prep work with you guys for it. So ta-da. knowing that particularly when our solutions cooperate, the boundary is very secure. You guys make a great point. You got to have an internal conversation. Like the leaders in the organization have to basically a war game or game plan of when all of our defenses fail, how do we keep the lights on what matters most? Do you guys have any advice on how to have that conversation? Because you're fundamentally planning, of course, to stop everything in the old model. We're realizing eventually something novel will get through. It's almost like it can be wrongly perceived as like an admittance of failure before you get started. How do you frame the conversation so that people listen and people aren't just thinking like from a CISO view, it's like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's just kind of quitting his job. It's like, you guys have made it clear they're going to achieve that boundary defense based on everything that you can tell.
Yeah.
How would you advise they lead that conversation internally so that their business partners actually listen to them, tell them critical systems, et cetera, so that they can do the full scope of this revised objective?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's primarily just in the way the conversation is framed. So not framing the conversation in technical terms, right? But actually framing the conversation in terms of like being able to articulate business impact, right? And being able to clearly articulate how these threats actually translate into material business impact.
Yeah, I mean, listen, anyone who knows me knows I'm a big fan of a pithy turn of phrase. I mean, failing to plan is planning to fail. I think you have an obligation to the organization, to your colleagues, to the business to examine all of the contingencies that are a reasonable outcome for what might happen in a normal operating environment, right? I mean, putting your head in the sand is a great way for the business to have a real bad day in a hurry. I mean, I don't know. I think to many people on the call or in the audience, as well as to my colleagues on stage, that's an obvious statement, but sometimes just articulating that is the first step towards having effective conversation around it.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, you got to understand, have a little bit of emotional intelligence of how to understand your business partners, who they are, not just as an organization or a unit, but as a personality, so you can hold that conversation and use the right language to get them to pay attention and not wrongly interpret things with false chicken littles that nobody's actually dealing with.
Sure.
Just in the interest of time, let's move on to the next slide and next objective to make sure we honor the time commitment here. So traditionally, CISOs have been considering these risks where it stops at breaches, and we can see that the actual mentality needs to shift significantly. Eddie, can you take kind of first cut this time at expanding a little bit on what our thoughts are here?
Yeah, I think this objective very closely sort of dovetails or aligns with the first objective that we already talked about, just that sort of mindset shift from, my primary job is to stop breaches, but rather to reduce business impact resulting from a breach, right? So really being able to understand blast radius associated with scenario A versus scenario B, compromised credential versus somebody, getting through the front gate, if you will. And some really interesting things to think about here is that from the moment a new or novel threat actually appears within intelligence reporting, whether it's publicly available threat intelligence or threat data versus private, right? How long does it actually take your organization to actually get signal on a new or emerging threat, to how quickly can you then translate that threat into leadership level briefing to be able to brief the executive team on that particular risk, right? And so this is an area, right, where if we intelligently apply some of the tools, very powerful tools that we have in our arsenal now that we didn't have a few years ago, like generative AI, right, to actually speed up this threat assessment process, we can drastically sort of like reduce that KPI down in terms of like a new threat is emerging, right? We have signal on a new threat. How quickly can we then intelligently brief and determine the risk impact to our business?
Yeah, that's pretty solid.
Yeah, Eddie, I'm curious. I hope you don't mind if I ask you a question, but I would like to get your opinion on. It's an interesting note. How fast is too fast? Like, we mentioned Chicken Little. James invoked the infamous Chicken Little earlier. I mean, how fast is too fast in your mind, right? Okay, you're getting a signal on a potential threat or an extension of an APT, previously known APT.
Mhm.
What in your mind, like when is that validated enough for you to run it up the flagpole versus needing to do a little bit more research, test, and validate that is an actual vector? I'm just curious to how you think about that.
Yeah, so it depends, but I think in general, based on a lot of the things that I've seen is, where a specific attack campaign or a specific threat, the sort of specifics around how that campaign is actually conducted and the entry vectors might be slightly different. At the end of the day, once that sort of initial foothold or that initial compromise is successful, the TTPs that follow tend to be like very well known or very, very similar in terms of like what the adversary will do. So I think it's really just a matter of like primarily being able to quickly be able to articulate and test whether the organization is resilient to that sort of like initial like modified or novel attack vector.
And that matches things I'm seeing in our customer base, where the large, like focusing on like a CTI response workflow to the question. The CTI team, of course, has a responsibility to elevate those net new understandings as soon as possible. With the platform partners like you and their operational perspective, they seem to want to elevate it after they understand the current impact, which obviously in most cases you hope it's nothing, and then the potential impact of if it were to occur. I've not seen any particular like in the conversations I've had, I've not been able to find a pattern of life of like 5 minutes or 5 hours is too fast, but it's more from a not time oriented perspective, but a like value of what's being shared perspective. Like if the elevation doesn't include some kind of here's how we are or could be impacted so that we can make then next order effects. It's that, I forget if it's data or information in the framework, but it's kind of more just raw data versus knowledge or information that you can make a decision on. And that seems to be the bigger threshold of by the time you're elevating it, can the recipient make a different choice about how to keep themselves safe? If yes, then it's ready. If not, then at least you're aware of it. If they ask questions, you're prepared to answer, but keep kind of drilling to that point before you go and put it on somebody's desk or mailbox or bulletin board or whatever the metaphorical equivalent is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that notion of limiting the blast radius, sometimes you need to know the size of the ordnance being used before you can get a handle on what the radius of the potential impact might be. So I think that's really smart, James.
No, I have seen some other organizations where like higher tiers want to know everything. They want 50 emails in their inbox a day, and nobody understands how they're reading them all, or even processing it, particularly given the feedback loop I have, some of the questions they still get asked. But so obviously organizational and cultural specifics need taken into account, but that's I think what we're talking about is the guiding principle that particularly people in a CISO role maybe can encourage the organization to understand you're going to be told this stuff when this much is ready. You can always ask, but understand our proactive delivery is going to have this quality before we give it to you.
I think that's right.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next objective, just again to make sure we get a full perspective here and have time for any of the Q&A at the end. Frank, kind of coming back to you first.
Oh, so
you're ready? No, I don't got to prep this at all.
Well, I'm looking at the little timer up in the upper left. I'm getting anxiety around us running a little long here. So, I mean, I think this is an interesting one. You know, third-party risk. How do I evaluate third-party tools and vendors? How do I evaluate the quality of what they're offering me? In the past, it's been predominantly a vendor management issue. It's been more of a procurement issue. CISOs have sort of been like, hey, that's a procurement issue. Like once they've sort of sorted it out, we'll operationalize it in a way that's good for the organization. And unfortunately, the third parties in general have evolved. You're not just buying a couple CDs anymore and installing a package into your own infrastructure, right? Everything's cloud connected. Everything's dependent on libraries. I mean, if you go back to Eddie's brief, I mean, I think one of the major threat vectors there was the JavaScript library threat. And so I think the challenge here is that it can no longer be passed. You can't pass the buck. CISOs need to own third-party risk. They need to own third-party relationships, and they need to make it a core security priority. I don't think that this is a controversial statement, but I do think that, many organizations I've worked with are maybe a little slow to adopt this stance when it comes to evaluating the breadth and depth of their exposure to third-party or counterparty risk, however you wanted to frame it up, right? I mean, our world is becoming increasingly technological, increasingly connected, increasingly data-driven, and unfortunately, that just grows the surface area that's available for threat actors to poke at and prod at and deploy vectors against.
I think that's well said. Eddie, what do you got to add to this wonderful conversation?
Yeah, I think this is just a core shift in thinking and taking third-party risk, more seriously than it's traditionally been. So this is obviously a core security concern. And then, being able to, have an accurate assessment in terms of not just for threats targeting us directly as an organization, but all of our kind of key suppliers or technology partners, subcontractors. Do we have services hosted in various geographical regions that are in war zones or near war zones that could potentially be impacted by kinetic activity, right? That can create systemic risk for the organization as a whole, right? And again, this is a very, very common, I mean, James, this, dealing with a lot of our customers here at Analyst One. This is one of the primary PIRs, priority intelligence requirements, that we address across all of our customer base, in terms of being able to provide that automatic classification of threat data and intelligence, and how it is aligned with their vendor management, their different technologies that they're using, so that they can not just provide continuous monitoring, but again, identify threats very, very quickly and be prepared to, generate briefings for executive level leadership relating to these third-party related risks.
One of the cues I use when new customers have been onboarding to our solution delivery, in terms of how important third-party intelligence reporting has been, is the kind of questions we get asked during the procurement cycle. It just to keep it really simple, did we get asked for our SOC 2 Type 2 report or not? Did we get asked about our testing process or not? Did they ask about our software delivery lifecycle and our third-party dependencies coming into our own platform delivery? Those organizations that are asking those questions of us as we become one of their third-party partners are also the ones that care about it a lot more. So it's really useful from an onboarding perspective that I know one thing that matters to them, but it's also been very telling. I think we are getting more consistently good questions on this. It is the norm now versus, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago. That kind of deep investigative set of questions was much less common. It's the norm today as we go through evaluations and acquisitions to become part of a customer's ecosystem.
Yep.
If we can go last slide, please. Or not last slide, next slide. I think that. So last question here, Eddie, putting you on the spot first.
Yeah.
Talk about success here. How should CISOs be defining success?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, this is a fundamental mind shift as well. So success means fewer alerts and fewer incidents. So I remember even, way back when I was, a consultant working with some unnamed three-letter agencies, right? I was doing network forensics at the time, right? And if I wasn't seeing a lot of alerts fire, right? We were using NetWitness at the time. And if I wasn't seeing a lot of alerts that I had set up in NetWitness firing, I would get very, very concerned or very, very scared. It wasn't the times when I saw fewer alerts that I felt better. It was the times when I saw more alerts, I felt better. So really, but the fundamental, getting back to the fundamental mind shift, right, is not fewer alerts and fewer incidents, but being able to make better, faster, more threat-informed decisions under pressure, right? Yeah. And again, this is a sort of a core thing that James, you and I deal with on a daily basis, is how do we intelligently classify threat intelligence, right? How do we classify risk to align with an organization's priorities, right? And then how do we then intelligently apply automation to reduce that gap between when a threat is known to when countermeasures are actually deployed into a customer's environment, right? Whether that's directly integrating content, detection content in their SIM, or deploying countermeasures to firewall, web proxy, email gateway, EDR tools, et cetera, right? How do we reduce that MTTD and MTTR down as quickly as possible based on high quality information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that says it all, James. I don't know that I have a whole lot of insightful commentary to add. I mean, I think, again, making sure that you can retain core operational efficiency and effectiveness in the throes of an event is critical, right? And having the information you need at hand and having the ability to prosecute against it is just it's a requirement. I think this mindset shift is a great capstone to this little discussion about the way in which the CISO domain is shifting quickly, and to some extent has already shifted, right? And if you're not here, you get caught up a little bit.
And I do have to have one parting shot. I think one of the things I've seen in this role and prior roles that are more like data analysis type functions, it always was terrible when people were like, well, let's just reduce the data volume and the problem's easier. It's like, no, that's the inverse problem. We have to respond to all these threats that Eddie summarized earlier, we have a data rich problem. We need all the context, and reduction in alarms isn't going to give us the solution we need. We've got to be able to make sure we have that perspective so that we can find the alarms that matter, because the one that doesn't fire is the one you probably didn't want to miss. Let's go ahead and move on to that next conversation. Frank, you mentioned earlier the 2-letter acronym, so I'd love to get your perspective first. Like in the broad scheme of things here, what about AI, and how does that influence all of this conversation we've had? And we can go ahead and go next slide while Frank starts to answer, please.
Yeah, I think from our perspective at Replica and talking to our customers, I mean, the term AI is obviously front of mind for everyone, and it serves many, many masters. I think in the context of our discussion today, I think it has a role as both an attack multiplier, or maybe amplifier, you might say, as well as presenting an entirely new attack surface that can be a target for threat actors. And I think what I would say, and I'm not going to ask you to go back to the slide, but going back to the slide about vishing, right? I mean, I'm sure many of you are also familiar with the Scattered Spider organization and sort of what they've been doing in the years past. I was at a briefing, and the question became: Are the voices deep fakes? Are they deep faking voices that are familiar or common to their targets, right? And so, as an attack amplifier multiplier, certainly AI is terrifying. I mean, just sort of anecdotally, when I was having my coffee this morning, I had CNBC on, and we're already getting the rhetoric. Oh, well, maybe Mythos is not that bad. I mean, maybe it was a little overblown. I don't know. I'm not smart enough, I think, to have an opinion on that, but I do think that it's important to understand that everything that we've lived through in the past decade, beyond only changing, what will be multiplied on an order of magnitude. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's hyperbole. I think we're looking at a step function increase in the ability of threat actors to perpetrate and commit crimes. Now, the good news is, James, to your point earlier, we also have tools at our disposal that will allow us to ingest and synthesize data as well to combat that, right? So there's two sides to that coin, but I think that you have to think about AI through a number of different lenses, and I like this first bullet as sort of the two lenses I think of them through.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally agree with you, Frank. Yeah, and again, I mean, we saw in some of the slides that I gave earlier on the threat briefing side how AI can be leveraged by cyber adversaries, not just to speed up the process of deploying more sophisticated things like crafting phishing emails that will get through email gateways and are more likely to entice victims to click on links and open attachments and those sorts of things. But with this latest version of Claude, actually being able to with very little training, being able to automatically discover and then weaponize zero-day vulnerabilities in pretty much any off-the-shelf software that's commonly in use. I mean, it's moving so fast, right? We would be derelict in our duties not to take this seriously. And then obviously on the enterprise attack surface side, worrying about things like data security, right, is the primary concern, prompt leakage, those sorts of things on the usage side of it. And I did see some interesting statistics as well, where more often than not, enterprise organizations aren't moving towards an approach of straight out banning use within their internal employees of using public LLMs, but rather just placing more guardrails and controls around usage of these external services as well, through a combination of policy enforcement and then also technical controls like DLP and those sorts of things. And then lastly, I did put on the slide, James, I'll turn it over to you for some thoughts in a moment, but I did put on the slide down there at the bottom. So I would specifically recommend everyone that's interested in the implications of AI security to definitely consider subscribing to Josh Sachs. So he's a former colleague of mine. I worked with him at Invincia years ago, and he's also the former AI security tech lead at Meta. So he has a lot of insightful content around AI security and the implications of AI to enterprise security. So I put his Substack URL down there at the bottom. I would definitely encourage everyone on the webinar to check out some of his content.
That's much appreciated. Having places to go of trusted authority is helpful. It's weird to hear us talk about AI prompts being injected and engineered in the same way that I remember from a decade ago, like SQL injection being such a big threat. Now AI is basically inadvertently allowing the same kind of problem. We want to open up to, in the time left, to some questions from the participants out there. So no prep on these ones, so we'll see what the audience came together for us. So whoever wants to address it to them first, if somebody's got a hard spot and they only have budget to improve one area, should they focus on ransomware recovery, supplier risk, or identity controls? Going back to those three things you briefed earlier, which one would be where you would focus?
Yeah, I mean, I would honestly start. I mean, I think if you could pick one, I would start with enforcing identity controls, getting back to that sort of like identity theft, credential abuse portion of the briefing. I mean that statistic that I was showing, are based on the Verizon data around just the increase in compromised credentials. I think that would be the place that I would start.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think, James, going back to your point a little bit earlier, maybe it's a pat answer or a cop out. I think you have to start with a real hard look in the mirror and understand your current capabilities in these three areas, right? And identify the one that could potentially be the weakest link. I mean, I think the identity one, I think identity in general, especially with sort of these non-human identities, right, as a burgeoning space that we see growing in cybersecurity, as well as all this agentic work that's happening, the identity layer is becoming increasingly vulnerable and one that does require particular attention. But of course, like if you have zero ransomware recovery strategy, or you have no supplier risk approach, then maybe obviously you want to identify the area in which you think can get into a reasonable place or can benefit the most from that budget. But it's always it's a tough spot to be in, right? You hopefully have money for all three.
Correct. All right. So next question, guys. How do you get board or executive buy-in for these controls when they seem operational rather than strategic? When you can't get the rest of the business to agree to our proposed new mindset for how CISOs should operate, how do you arm wrestle them into compliance?
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, you catch more flies with honey, right? I mean, I think one of the things Eddie had mentioned earlier, and I think what he was trying to say, he said much more eloquently than I'm about to, but like one of the underappreciated skills for anyone, but specifically for those of us in security, is good communication skills.
Mm-hmm.
How do you frame the problem and measure it in areas that will resonate with your audience, right? I mean, it's fine and well and good to talk about technical and security related things, but you got to bring it back to something that is meaningful to your audience and make it real for them. And I think that, you know, in many cases, it's a share price or it's a revenue number or it's something along those lines that will finally encourage folks in the boardroom to move on a thing. But I don't know. What do you think, Eddie?
Yeah, I think again, it kind of gets back. I agree with you. I think it kind of gets back to what I was trying to say a little bit earlier in terms of like, it's all how you frame the conversation, right? And what evidence you can actually, hard evidence you can actually bring to bear. So like, obviously when you're approaching the executive team or, you know, the board with these sorts of things, they're not going to buy like, oh, we need, getting back to the last point about identity controls. They're not going to buy like, oh, we need better MFA, right? They don't understand things in those terms, right? So what you need to do is frame the conversation instead of like, we need better MFA or identity and access management, right? They buy like, we need reduced probability of material business interruption and faster response to incidents, right? Like that's sort of like more along the terms of they understand, they care about business impact, right? Yeah. And so again, that just sort of gets back to like, you know, what James and I do on the Analyst One side is we're really trying to, at least with our platform, right, translate from the technical requirements, right? That sometimes our customers can get kind of wrapped around the axle, you know, too wrapped up in the technical nitty gritty, where we try to take those requirements and translate those into material business outcomes, right? Like what is the, not just the CTI program, but what is a cybersecurity program in general looking to achieve, and how do we actually meet and exceed those business outcomes?
Well said. So we talked about this a little, but I guess someone wants to go a little deeper. Is this rise in ransomware really being driven by AI, or is AI just making old tactics more effective?
Yeah, I think it's more the second one, honestly. I just think that AI, the advent of AI, is just making you know, previously and older intrusion paths just cheaper, faster, and easier to implement. Like it's just lowering the barrier of entry. So obviously it's making the more sophisticated cybercrime enterprises more effective rather, but it's also just lowering the barrier of entry for smaller time players as well. So
yeah, it lowering the barrier of entry in many ways, right, Eddie? I mean, like the skills barrier is also lower, right? It used to be that you had to have a certain skill set to successfully execute attacks like this, and now you can just ask ChatGPT.
And exactly, it gets back to like the example of the, you know, phishing as a service toolkits, right? Where, you know, even 5 years ago, right, setting up a convincing phishing campaign, sending that out to your targets, right, with a high probability of click-through rates, and then setting up all the associated infrastructure, right, including you know, multi-stage credential intercept, right, where you're not just capturing initial username, password, but also MFA credentials or SSO cookies, right? Like that took some serious effort to set up that level of infrastructure, right? That would obviously be only useful for a very, very short period of time for a specific attack campaign, right? Now with these toolkits, right, it can essentially be set up in a matter of minutes or hours, right? So
sounds like you're describing the tools allow more of a spray and pray opportunity driven, just let's just see what happens. And there's so much lower cost try it, and again, if people just wouldn't want to do bad things, we would have different jobs. All right, so last question we're at our call out today. Is AI even safe to use with sensitive internal data? You guys talked about using it on both fronts. We all agree it has an opportunity. We already clearly identified it as an opportunity to make the attackers better. Can AI be safely used on our internal data to, help defend ourselves better?
Yeah. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a controversial stance here. I'm gonna say no. I think. I guess here's how I would say that. If we're defining AI as like traditional frontier models or non-self-hosted LLMs that you don't have complete concrete control over compute as well as ingress and egress into that model, then I would say no. I mean, look at the term, it's your sensitive internal data, right? I mean, why in the world would you even risk putting that into a system that you don't have controls wrapped around? So, if you're running your own localized models, a Llama model in Bedrock, actually maybe not even Bedrock if you're super cynical, but if you got your own rack and you're sort of putting that stuff in play, then great. But for me, for my customers, I would say the answer is no.
It's a good perspective.
Yeah. I'll take a little bit more of a moderate position. I'll just say yes, with the well thought out and implemented guardrails in place. So that includes like a combination of both policy and technical controls. I touched on a few of those before, like DLP solutions, both the network and endpoint, comprehensive like AI chat logging, right? Being able to tightly control downstream actions that can occur via AI, right? So all these are basically like, just like most things in security, right? It's a multifaceted approach to, securing this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I might say, just as a closing thought, anecdotally, this is the fundamental tension that leaders are sort of grappling with, in my experience, in our customer base today, which is the market need to move at the speed of innovation, but the organizational need to be exceptionally cautious in doing so. And I think that question, in my opinion, which by the way, I think both of our answers were reasonable, will be the driver of how the landscape unfolds, at least in the next 18 months, in my opinion.
Yeah, how to manage the risk. Like if an organization feels the need to move faster, how do they manage the risk of a speed leads to error? I know we've had an interesting perspective, not to name who, but some of our customers in the financial industry, we've had some open conversation with them around AI usage, and they had an interesting take that it was really driven by the contract. Like it didn't come down to the technology, but it came down to if something goes bad, is there a binding legal agreement going to provide appropriate damages, financial damages restitution to cover things? And that's an effective, I think, elevation point from a business-driven decision of like if there's a negative downstream effect, but whoever you're using can properly handle the financial consequences of this, it helps manage it some. But that certainly is, I think, to the point you guys brought up earlier on like elevating our objective level thinking. Traditionally, a CISO wouldn't think that way, but as a business perspective, that now becomes in line because there's a mitigation strategy to a potential negative effect. So Frank, Eddie, thank you very much for the time today, your deep insight, your experience, and putting the conversation together. So there's a few other questions, but sorry we weren't able to get to them, everybody. To the audience, thank you for your time. Obviously, we are going to keep doing things like this together, and we look forward to the next opportunity to talk to you about how to keep yourselves safer. And if you are a CISO, good luck.
I enjoy the conversation. Thanks, James. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Had a blast.